Hi, everyone. I'm here to talk to you about what the Cold War was like under President Truman. So we're talking 1945, right at the end of World War II. Remember, we start into the Cold War, and Truman's in office until 1953. So first thing we need to understand is that in World War II, remember the Russians and the Americans were on the same side. And so the Russian troops were coming into Germany from the east, they're in red, and the British, the Americans, were coming in from the west. And eventually, of course, forced Germany to surrender. But after World War II, a lot of Russian troops are going to stay where they were because they wanted to protect themselves in the future. And so this is going to lead to the rise of satellite states, extensions, in other words, of the Soviet Union, as those red troops, those communist troops are going to remain in those countries. They're then going to be forced to fall to communism as well. So after World War II, it got so obviously divided that east of this line pictured here all turned to communism, and everything west of it was influenced more by the British and the Americans turning non-communist. In fact, Churchill warned against this when he gave his famous Iron Curtain speech, saying that this was a very clear divide that was bad for the world. So the goal of the United States that Truman begins, the fundamental foreign policy objective is going to be one of containment. This starts when Truman is president, and it's going to go on for the entire duration of the Cold War. There'll be some subtle nuances, slight tweaks to this policy, but this is the core foreign policy objective. The key is that the U.S. was trying to stop the spread, in other words, to contain communism. They want to stop Stalin on this map from taking over more and more countries. So how is Truman going to do that? First thing is he's going to issue a speech in 1947. This often is kind of looked at as the official declaration of the Cold War. He delivers this speech as Greece and Turkey were worried that they were going to fall to communism. Remember, communism especially appeals to poorer people, and there was some turmoil happening in these countries. And so President Truman says that this is a much bigger issue, that we need to provide free people the ability to work out their own destinies. And he asks Congress for some money to help Greece and Turkey from falling to communism, and he gets $400 million. So this is kind of the first big kind of admittance that this is going to be our policy, and this kind of shows the world that the United States is no longer going to be isolationist. The next big thing that you should know, kind of example of this containment policy, is the Marshall Plan that's going to be passed by Congress in 1947. And as you can see from this image, it's aid that's being delivered to European countries. And so the idea was that, hey, remember, if communism tends to appeal to people who are more under economic distress, let's try to help post-World War II Europe rebuild itself so that hopefully they don't fall to communism. And so here you can see just how much money was provided to the various countries. It was offered to everyone, but here's who took us up on it. And altogether is about $13 billion of aid that is given to 15 different countries in Europe. It's a lot of money, $13 billion. In today's money, it'd be like $135 billion. So it was a big investment, but if you can tell from this chart, this table here, that none of the countries that took it end up falling to communism. So you could argue in some ways that it did work. And even though it was a lot of money, now that those countries are obviously rebuilt themselves, they can obviously then start buying American goods. So it ended up not being as economically devastating as you might imagine to the United States. Here's kind of proof that the Marshall Plan worked. Here's in West Germany, a city called Hamburg before the Marshall Plan. After this big economic revitalization, you can see that things had definitely turned around. So that is the Marshall Plan, a huge economic package to try to revitalize post-World War II Europe, but also to keep communism out of it. The first real confrontation of the Cold War is actually going to occur in Berlin, Germany. So after World War II and Germany loses, the different Allied powers had divided up influence of Germany, as you can see pictured by this map. But the problem was that the capital of Germany, Berlin, was located in the Soviet Union influenced East Germany. So the Allies decided to actually divide up Berlin as well, as you can see on this map. So here's Berlin, and it is also divided. East Berlin is going to be influenced by the Soviets, just like East Germany is, and West Germany is influenced by the non-communist Allied forces, and same with West Berlin. Problem was that Joseph Stalin, the head of the Soviet Union, decides that he wants to cut off all supply routes to West Berlin. He was hoping that eventually the Allies would just give it up and he could then maintain control of Berlin. Truman was worried. He obviously had the option to just give up Berlin. We could start a real showdown with Stalin, but that could get ugly when you're dealing with nuclear weapons and so forth. Or instead, Truman decides to airlift in supplies to those non-communist people that were living in West Berlin. And so the British and the Americans flew about 300,000 missions round the clock for almost a year, dropping off supplies into that blockaded section of Berlin. Ultimately, and so the world was on edge for about 11 months, not knowing kind of what was going to happen here. But ultimately, after 11 months, Stalin lifts the blockade and things go back to the way it was. In the aftermath of that, we get some mutual defense pacts being formed. NATO was formed in 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This was a mutual defense pact to try to stop the spread of communism. A few years later, those communist countries respond with a defense pact of their own, the Warsaw Pact. NATO is still around to this day. You can see the progression here. When NATO started, there were 12 members. Even to this day, we're up to 30 members that are a part of this mutual defense pact. So there's another example of the U.S. trying to contain communism, in this case, getting involved in this alliance system. And the next thing that happened that was a big deal was in 1949, China falls to communism. So there's Chairman Mao making that happen. So now you've got the largest country in the world becoming communist. So a deep, deep threat to the United States, as we're worried, where is this going to stop? So that brings us to 1950. Korea had been divided after World War II. It was originally controlled by the Japanese, and so with the Japanese losing in World War II, the north part of the Korean peninsula is going to be now influenced by the Soviets, and the southern is going to be influenced by non-communist allied forces, including the United States. But to the surprise of many, the communists in North Korea invade South Korea in 1950. And so President Truman has to decide, what are we going to do? We were worried that this was just going to be one of many instances of a communist campaign to try to take over the world. And so non-intervention was not an option. So with that, we actually go to war. So this is the first military action of the Cold War. Troops are sent in to try to push those communist forces back. And eventually then China, remember that had recently fallen to communism, enters the war on the part of the North Koreans and help kind of push a lot of those troops back, as you see on the left. But then eventually the communist forces in red are pushed back. And as you can see, there's an armistice line, a ceasefire, but things end in kind of a stalemate, and things aren't very different from how they began. We still have North Korea that is going to remain communist, and South Korea will remain non-communist, and that's the way it is to this day. So while it started off as kind of a defensive war, just trying to stop communism from spreading, it eventually ended up getting even bigger than that. This got really deadly for a lot of the soldiers. And the summer there, for instance, it was one of the hottest and driest summers on record. There's a lot of stories of desperate American soldiers so thirsty that they were forced to drink water from rice paddies that had actually been fertilized with human waste. So as a result, not surprisingly, there was a big problem with disease. Altogether, there are about 5 million people that die in this war. Unfortunately, it's often called the Forgotten War. This is the Korean War monument that was finally constructed in 1995 to honor the fallen. But about 5 million people lost their lives. About half of those were civilians. As far as Americans were concerned, it's just over 54,000 American soldiers that died trying to stop communism from spreading. So ultimately, containment did work here in the sense that communism did not spread, but obviously we didn't get rid of it. But that was not the overarching objective. This, like so many of the other events we just talked about under Truman, was all about containing communism, stopping its spread. And the Korean War is just one example of that. All right, hope that helps, guys. Have a great rest of your day.